As I mentioned yesterday, and as I want to share with you today, I deeply regretted not being with you on Rosh Hashanah. I was unfortunately ill-disposed to be with you. I will say to you that I was watching a number of services online throughout Rosh Hashanah, and in one of them, Rabbi Sue Shankman-Namath of Washington Hebrew Congregation seemed to speak directly to me. She told the story of a mother entering her son's room and finding her son in bed and asking her son to get up, saying to him, "You need to get up, you need to pull yourself together, it's time to go to temple." For the son to refuse to get up, to say that he was tired, that he did not want to get up, that today was not going to be the day. For that conversation to continue, for eventually the mother to more forcefully say, "Now get up, get yourself together, and go to temple." For the son to say, "No, I am not going to temple," and pull the covers over his head. For the mother then to go over to her son, remove the covers from his head, and say to him, "Now, get up, get yourself together, and go to temple." For this moment of silence to ensue, and for the son to then resentfully say, "Why?" And for the mother then to say to him, "I'll give you two reasons. Number one, you're 53 years old. And number two, you're the rabbi." So here I am, lying in bed with COVID-19. I happen to be 53 years old, and I happen to be a rabbi. And I thought, how did she know? We've clarified that since. But all of this to say, I'm really delighted to be with you. And you may be relieved to know that I had anticipated offering you my words on Rosh Hashanah, and that I will not burden you with two sermons at this time. I would like to say a few words and to speak with you about a couple of subjects that are linked in my mind and that are especially important to me around this time of year, that relate to our world, that relate to the way we experience our world. One of these subjects is Israel and Zionism, and not Israel and Zionism per se, but the way Israel and Zionism are perceived and what it is that we make of Israel and Zionism. And the other is the phenomenon of book banning, of the rejection of information, of the rejection of other points of view, of the cancellation of other points of view, of the kind of fragmentation that is occurring in our society. I've been thinking a great deal about this particular subject this year, and as I started to look into it earlier in the year, I thought, well, we can speak about this relatively simply and superficially and meaningfully, because who is for book banning, and really at the end of the day, how complicated does this get? For me to discover, as I was doing my research, that this year alone there have been more than 1,500 applications to ban books from various school boards and from libraries. The number has more than trebled from the last year and has increased exponentially from years past. Applications are coming in fast and furious in what is becoming an increasingly contentious debate regarding our direction of our learning, our public support for challenging or perhaps unpopular ideas. And this is a reflection of the growing contention regarding the boundaries of acceptable subjects and the language of public discourse in the face of unprecedented access to information, especially through our digital resources. And of course, little by way of boundary setting, little by way of the regulation of the data we can consume. And we see the implications of this every single day. Now, of course, book banning, the rejection of material, the attempt to regulate the information we read or learn or see are not new. These processes we see unfold throughout our country, seeking to delineate what kind of informations and ideas the public, through taxpayer resources, should support, are also not new. They've taken place in this country, they've taken place in other countries. Yet, this has become a tidal wave. And the debates over the banning of information, the rejection of information, have become more adversarial. They've become more politicized, like everything else in our society. With the efforts to ban books, we have seen this spread of rejection extend to such works as Maus, the graphic novel about the Holocaust, and a translation of the diary of Anne Frank, this once obscure and more marginal concern about the banning of books, about the withdrawal of information, about taking away material from our educational curricula and resources, is now hitting much closer to home. And with regard to Zionism, I wanted us to think for a moment about Zionism as a movement that started as an idealistic, somewhat unrealistic expression of the religious vision of a handful of rabbis and other intellectuals, a vision of the regathering of the exiles in the land of Israel. And one of the turning points to its transformation into a political machine, into a real campaign, into something that is real and in our lives, occurred approximately 100 years ago. Just 100 years ago. Most of us spend little time thinking about this, but it was 100 years ago this summer that the League of Nations, the organization preceding the United Nations, ratified and officially sanctioned Great Britain's mandate over Palestine, with a view to creating a Jewish national home there. So what had started only decades before as a somewhat marginal musing of a handful of intellectuals, thinkers, religious leaders, would 100 years ago, almost to the day, be transformed into an internationally recognized, legitimate, respectable foundation for a plan that now urgently needed to be fleshed out, organized, and implemented. We forget these now seemingly small transformations, these pieces of historical information, these landmark moments. But the ceremonial arrival of General Allenby, the commander of British troops, the conquering hero, into Jerusalem in 1917, riding this magnificent white steed, was seen by some of our co-religionists, including the senior rabbi of the temple at this time, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, as a sign of the dawning of a messianic age. As was celebrated the arrival of the first High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, a Jew who would for the first time in almost 2,000 years be charged with the administration of Palestine only a few years later. Our own Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver's Zionist activities transformed from intellectual debate, ambassadorship, and promotion to focused political organizing and the building of an American Jewish campaign throughout the 1920s and the 1930s as a consequence of the events we speak about now. Looking back, it seems almost miraculous. It seems barely believable. The lessons of that time are also profoundly relevant to this current moment in American Jewish history, to the way we approach our divisions and debates, because there was division and debate within the Jewish world and outside the Jewish world, and to our organizing efforts around values, around lofty goals, around the core, the essence of that which relates to our greater world beyond our immediate geographic and time-bound interests. And of course, these two subjects, the subjects of book banning, the rejection of information, the rejection of material, the debate about the information that we consume, and Zionism are both profoundly and in certain ways bizarrely related. Book banning shaped Judaism and in many ways shaped the divide in today's Jewish world. Just a couple of examples. Almost 800 years ago, a French-born Jew who had converted to Christianity wrote a letter to the Pope complaining that the Talmud contained heresies against Christianity. That was in 1232. Complaining that these heresies could not be tolerated. At the time, the word Ashkenaz, and most of us here in the room, I suspect, are somehow in one way or another Ashkenazi Jews. The word Ashkenaz didn't mean Germany and Eastern Europe and Poland, the Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, White Russia, Russia. That was not the meaning of the word Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz meant northern France and the very west of Germany. That's the literal meaning of the word Ashkenaz. At the time, Ashkenaz, northern France and the west of Germany, were the world center of Jewish scholarship and innovation. A trial of the Talmud, effectively a trial of rabbinic Judaism, followed this complaint. It took about a decade. Within a decade of legal process and wrangling, back and forth, fits and starts, the church decided to censor the Talmud, to censor the work of the rabbis, and to destroy rabbinic books that contained the heresies against Christianity. The printing press had not yet been invented. All books at the time were copied by hand. We today know that copying the Talmud by hand at the time would have taken between 5 and 6 years for one scribe. Books were treasured. They were highly expensive. They were the guarantors of the transmission of our culture. In the summer of 1242, 780 years ago, approximately 24 cartloads, led by oxen, filled with handwritten Talmudic manuscripts, seized from northern France and the western edges of Germany, thousands upon thousands of volumes and manuscripts were burnt in the center of Paris. Within a generation, the center of Jewish life and learning in Ashkenaz, in France and Germany, disappeared. Nothing is left of that culture. The Talmud you would find in my office and in so many other rabbinic libraries around the country and the world is the censored Talmud. It is censored by the church. That is the Talmud we have left for us. There isn't another. And censorship was not limited to Christianity. Rabbis regularly censored and banned the writings of others, Jews and especially non-Jews, and sought to restrict access to information that might be damaging to our faith. Among the books that were censored was also the now highly celebrated, the acclaimed Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides. On more than one occasion, rabbis organized book seizures to control the spread of that information, and burnings of the writings of Maimonides. In certain parts of the Jewish world, this material was not studied or tolerated throughout almost 200 years. And we know what the poet Heinrich Heine said in his great warning to humanity, a warning that would come true around the time of the Holocaust. In the place they burn books, they will one day burn people. Within one generation at the turn of the 20th century, censorship and book banning became a weapon, a tool that would define the social struggles and division that we live with to this very day. In America, the rise of Darwinism and other scientific innovations led to a concerted effort among religious groups, especially a group of Christian scholars at the time and activists, to ban these books from their communities, from their libraries, and from their curricula. A number of these scholars would come together and publish a two-set volume of dogmatic Christian teachings. They called this volume The Fundamentals. The movement they created about 100 to 110 years ago is called fundamentalism. You may have heard about it. We live with the implications of the struggle between science and religion in our society, between the attempt to shelter certain groups from certain elements of information to this very day. Around the very same period, only a few years behind, a group of traditional rabbis who were alarmed and concerned about the politicization and secularization of Zionism sought to ban an increasing number of books and pamphlets produced by other Jews and exercise tighter control of their community's educational curricula. They banned secular and Zionist writings, and they succeeded. The division between liberal and secular Jews on the one hand, and very traditional Jews who reject secular and liberal learning and culture on the other, and that at the time rejected Zionism. This has proven to be the most salient, complex, and adversarial division the Jewish known as world within the past century. We live with its implications. We live with it in this country. We live with it in this city. We live with it in Israel. We live with it everywhere we turn. Enter a person you haven't heard about, or perhaps haven't heard about. Alfred J. Balfour. Alfred J. Balfour was a scholar, an academic, a commentator, and a writer, an amateur philosopher and a theologian in England in the late 19th and early 20th century. He was a political figure who rose brilliantly through the ranks of leadership to be appointed Prime Minister of Britain 120 years ago in 1902. He served as Prime Minister until 1905. Balfour, whom most of us do not know today, was likely among the 3 or 4 most highly accomplished, sophisticated, and scholarly of British politicians and prime ministers throughout the past, perhaps 250 years. But if we recognize his name at all, it is likely not for his extraordinary writing and career, his insight into Irish affairs, the unfolding of developments in Europe that would lead to World War I, his commentaries, his critical scholarship. These are not why we remember him. If we know his name, and those of us who know his name, we likely do so because of one 5-line letter that he wrote to Lord Rothschild in early November of 1917. Then, serving as Foreign Secretary with Prime Minister Lloyd George, then Lord Balfour, now the senior statesman and the senior statesman-type figure of the British establishment, of the British aristocracy, wrote a note to Rothschild saying that Her Majesty's government was positively inclined to the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. The note became known as the Balfour Declaration and set the stage for the British mandate, the efforts of the League of Nations, and eventually the United Nations vote almost exactly 30 years later in November of 1947. The vote that offered international recognition to the State of Israel that was about to be born. In a letter of 5 lines, Balfour set the stage for all that was to follow on the international scene. His letter set 2 conditions for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. 1, that the religious and political rights of other communities, of non-Jewish communities now residing in Palestine, would not be adversely affected by the creation of a national Jewish home there. And number 2, that the religious and political rights of Jews living anywhere else in the world would not be adversely affected by the creation of a national home in Palestine either. These would become the foundational markers of the Zionist movement for generations to come. Not bad for a 5-line letter. And this would be more than sufficient reason for us to speak of Lord Balfour today, but it is not the only one. Following his tenure as Prime Minister, Balfour made a number of efforts at creating the beginnings of an intellectual framework that would bridge the growing back between religion and science. While not a full-time theologian, he did occupy himself with theology and was troubled by the separation of science from religion, by what he saw as the banning of information, the rejection of information on both sides, and the diminishing conversation and exchange among leading figures in both fields. To say this more briefly and superficially, he saw and was worried about scientists' dismissal of religion and the human experience that it offered, and religious leaders' dismissal of science as irrelevant to religion. An entire series of lectures he delivered at the University of Glasgow on this subject was published in a wonderful volume called Theism and Humanism. In my view, Balfour offered the single most accessible, cogent, and coherent view of the problem that would lead to a divide that has now so profoundly affected our lives, our culture, and our political environment to this day. To summarize his findings and insights, Balfour takes issue with the questions and assumptions made by scientists and religionists who negate the contributions of their perceived opponents. He holds that science itself is anchored in faith, faith in our capacity to perceive, to reason, to weigh evidence. At the same time, religion is not necessarily reflected in science and its findings, and cannot afford to dismiss this part of its essence should it reject science. Speaking of the scientist's approach to religion, he writes as follows: "Life, they would admit, is but a poor thing if it does no more than fill with vain desire the brief interval between two material accidents, the accident that brought it into being and the accident that will extinguish it forever. But this is no argument. A wise person faces facts. A good person prefers the hardest truth to the most alluring of illusions. If there be no ground for assuming a living purpose behind the indifferent mask of nature, let us not fill the vacancy with a phantasm of our own creation. Let us at least sink back into the nothingness from which we rose with our intellectual integrity undamaged. Let all other values perish so long as rational values remain undimmed." And he continued, They search for proof of God as people search for evidence about ghosts and witches. Show us, they say, the marks of God's presence. Tell us what problem God's presence would solve, says the scientist. And Balfour's response addresses both religionists who reject science and scientists who reject religion and its material when he writes, God is itself the condition of scientific knowledge. If God be excluded from the causal series, which produces beliefs, the cognitive series which justifies them is corrupted at the root. And as it is only a theistic setting that beauty can retain its deepest meaning and love its brightest luster, so these great truths of aesthetic and ethics are but half-truths, isolated and imperfect. Unless we add to them, we must hold that reason and the works of reason have their sources in God, that from God they draw their inspiration, and that if they repudiate their origin, by this act they proclaim their own insufficiency. For Balfour, God and faith and the conversation between the two are not only the state of learning and knowledge, but also the yearning and inspiration for advancement and growth of the pursuit of reason, the sense of discomfort with the world as it is, and the urgency and impetus to change it, to move the needle, to repair, to mend, to bridge the gaps of our lives. And speaking of these gaps in our lives and our wishes to fill and transcend them, the author C.S. Lewis, who attested to being profoundly influenced by the writings of Alfred Balfour, offered yet another image in one of his correspondences that I would like to share with you. This is a letter to fellow author Sheldon Van Auken, wherein he wrote, "A wish may lead us to false beliefs, granted. But what does the existence of the wish suggest? At one time, I was much impressed by the line, "Nor does the being hungry prove that we have bread, but surely, though it does not prove that one particular person will get food, it does prove that there is such a thing as hunger and food." If we were a species that does not formally eat and normally eat, if we were not designed to eat, would we be hungry? We say the materialist universe is ugly. I wonder, how did we discover that? If we are already a product of the materialistic universe, how is it that we do not feel at home here? Do fish complain of the sea being wet? Or if they did, would that fact itself not strongly suggest that they had not always, or would not always be purely aquatic creatures? Why? Unless indeed there is something about us that is not temporal. And so I say to all of you today, at the start of the year 5783, to all of you who perhaps at one point or another have felt uncomfortable with the world around you, who felt that the world was fractured, that we are unable to have conversations, that we spend our time banning and rejecting information instead of speaking to each other, who have felt that our political culture, our civil culture, our culture in general is broken, who have yearned for change, who have yearned to move the needle. No, according to C.S. Lewis, that this yearning, the sense of discomfort, is part of faith. Know that what it represents is that this sense of discomfort within our families, within our homes, within our places of work, within our cities, within our communities, within our culture in general, is a sign we wish for things to change. It is an indication that change is possible. It is perhaps a signal of faith in God. For all of you who have found yourself this year wondering, how is it that the Diary of Anne Frank or that mouse would be banned by libraries and school curricula? For all of those who thought to yourself, how is it that we cannot speak to our neighbors? Why is it that our lives are so challenging? I say, seize that feeling. Hold on to it. And take in that feeling a measure of hope. It is the sign of a future redemption to come. It is the glimmer, the light that emerges out of the ashes. As we launch the year 5783 and recall the miracles in our lives, I wish for you, in the words of Alfred Balfour, that beauty this year retain its deepest meaning, and love its brightest luster, that these great truths of aesthetic and ethics may be full truths and should not live as half-truths in our hearts, isolated and imperfect. 100 years ago, no one knew a state of Israel would be founded. We do not know what is around the corner. Faith is all we have. Shana Tova.